Good afternoon, everybody. Morning. I'm William. I've been in the security space for, I'd say about 12 years now. I've seen it all, and it's been an interesting ride. The fun part about security for me is the fact that you get to be on the front lines. You get to see the attacks. You get to see what's going on. Like I was just speaking to my dad this weekend, who they still live down in Laurel. I live in Florida, and he was like, "Well, what is it that hackers look for?" And I say, "Well, hackers look to break things, right? That's the mindset. If you have an application, you have an environment, they want to figure out how to break it. So part of security is understanding what someone might try to do, either intentionally or unintentionally, to break your services. And that's part of what we try to help mitigate for the state of Delaware. So I will try to keep onto the time frame pretty well. I do like this to be informative, so I'm going to try to tell you some things that we've seen throughout the threat landscape, things that we're seeing today. Which is kind of interesting. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what RedShield does, some of the things that we offer to try to help with that. So going into the risk landscape of 2025, right? One of the things that we find that's pretty interesting, when you think about security, and for that matter, where are the attack surfaces? So credentials are still the main target, right? So probably most of you know that a lot of hackers will go out and they'll find a database of username and passwords, and they'll just load that into a script and they'll start lobbing away at stuff. And there's various tools that help mitigate that, but one of the ones that is often overlooked is MFA. Just for example, for me, when I go to a bank, I'm not going to sign up at a bank that does not at least offer MFA. So if they're not offering it, right away I kind of like check them off as a risk, right? Because I do think that MFA is important and necessary. And hackers, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for the easy, low-hanging fruit. So credential stuffing, of course, is still there. Phishing and email scams have been an interesting part of the horizon. And then vulnerability exploitation. Now, what's a little bit interesting is that we're seeing the vulnerability exploitation on the rise as the initial access step. And why do I say that? So they're looking at it from the perspective of what's the easiest thing that I can do to gain access to an infrastructure and start launching my attacks. Whether that attack might be, I want to get information off of a database, that might be cross-site scripting, I want to force your application to do something to your clients that they may not expect, right? That allows me entry to them. There's all kinds of different use cases, but the point is that you still have credentials being one of the biggest vulnerabilities. So, things like MFA, making sure that your username and passwords are unique, right? It sounds simple enough, and I'm sure all of us here are doing that today, but just, something to remind others about. If you're not doing those simple steps, you're really hurting yourself in the long run. And so that's, something that needs to be discussed. All right, so here were some of the attacks that we saw in recent times. So you can see some interesting names there: United Healthcare, attack in 2024, Real Estate Wealth Network, American Water, which I put those in there because I thought that was kind of interesting to see that those companies were targeted. And you can see there, some of the impact of those, $872 million cyber attack. Some argued that was potentially due to a lack of MFA, right? So whether or not that's the main thing, we don't know, but that's for United Healthcare to figure out. Then over on the left, you see, there was 20 major cyber attacks in 2024. 26% of breaches were web application attacks involved. And then an interesting fact that I found was only 13% of vulnerabilities get remediated. This was on a sample of 1,000 companies, but that's a pretty good sample. That tells you that vulnerabilities are not being remediated fast enough. And then the last one, the RockU 2024, 10 billion passwords exposed. So what do I do as a hacker? Well, I take usernames. How do I find usernames? I can do it in different ways. One of the ways that I've seen that's pretty easy and easy enough is going to LinkedIn. I can get LinkedIn information, and I got your password information. Now I take this database of 10 billion passwords, I throw it into a script, and I just launch it at your different sites that you might have. How many in here use, let's say, Bank of America, Chase, Wells Fargo, any major banking institution, right? By raise of hands, right? Most of you, right? So a pretty good amount of you use them. Now I know that you guys are using those 4 or 5 big banking institutions. I take your username and password and I just launch it into my attack, right? And that's what I'm going to do as a hacker. So these are the things that you want to consider with your overall security strategy. All right, so here was another fun find for us. was, and we're seeing this on the rise, and this isn't true for everyone, but it is true for a lot more than it was in the past. So a lot of attacks are being launched from within the United States. Now, why is that important? So one, if I'm only using some form of geo-blocking as my security, then I'm already shooting myself in the foot, because I now have the majority of the attacks that in some cases are coming from the United States. So I can't rely on geo-blocking anymore. Okay, well, what about other things? What about like rate limiting? Okay, rate limiting works to an extent, but as a hacker, I just throttle down my attack. Now instead of launching, let's just say 1,000 hits in 1 minute, I'll slow it down. I'll do 1,000 in an hour, right? And now I get past your rate limiting. So your rate limiting doesn't work. So there's all these different things that you want to look at from a general perspective of a hacker. What are they thinking about to get around your security solutions, and what security solutions do you have in place today? All right, so as I mentioned, right, these US-based IP attacks are becoming a problem. Why? Session tracking, IP reputation, and geo-blocking. That's the other thing that we're seeing that's interesting. A lot of people rely on IP reputation. Not that it's not valuable. Again, even the things I mentioned before, geo-blocking, rate limiting, et cetera, those are all good tools, but they're only so effective. And now you've got IP reputation as well. Well, if I'm randomizing my IP, if I'm using residential IP addresses, and I'm randomizing them so well that they're not showing up on IP reputation score databases, well, now you can't rely on that. So what are you going to do? So the next thought that comes to mind is, well, how are they doing this? How are they randomizing their IP so well? Are they legitimate? Because I can't just spoof the IP. If I'm spoofing the IP, is everybody good with that term? If I say spoofing, everybody pretty good with what? Okay. So if I spoof the IP, I can only do that with certain types of traffic. For communications that I need two-way communication, I can't spoof it, right? I have to have ownership of that entity or that IP. So we thought about how are they doing these things? And when we investigate it, what we found out that a lot of these proxies, ironically, are running on third-party apps that you might put on your TV or your phone. So think about like a popular game that you might have. In fact, one of the ones up there, I think it was the Oxy Labs ones, when I looked at it, 10 million downloads. So 10 million people out on the internet in the world are actually using this game. And what is that game being used for? It's actually being used to launch attacks. How can that be, right? I don't think the game developers intended to be bad actors, right? I don't assume that. So what is it that happened? They put code into their application that now has a backdoor. Everybody good? If I say backdoor, everybody understands like a backdoor into their code. So they use that backdoor, and now they're launching their attacks from the game app without my knowledge, right? Me as the user, as the consumer, I love this game, it's a fun game, but I don't know that it's being used in an adversarial way. So now, there's this blind spot. You go back to the game, the app developer, and you say, hey, you've got this vulnerability. They don't even know about it. They patch it, right? But then the hacker is just on to the next game developer. And probably they found a GitHub repository, had the same code in it, they use it over again, or the process just repeats itself. So this is how these IPs are being used for these types of nefarious activities. All right, so another thing that we found was like AI being involved in CAPTCHA. And it's not just AI, but let's just assume that AI now, unfortunately, is being able to get past CAPTCHA. So the question comes, is CAPTCHA still a good thing? Yes, CAPTCHA is still a good thing, but if you're only relying on that as part of your trust of your endpoint user, of your client, then you're also doing yourself a disservice, because now the CAPTCHAs are being bypassed by AI. That lower picture that you see, I don't know if you guys have seen that on the internet before, but that is essentially a CAPTCHA farm, right? So that's a human sitting behind a bunch of different tablet devices, and their actual job is just to sit there and solve CAPTCHAs all day, right? They're being paid to do that. Why? Because in a lot of cases, CAPTCHA itself, to serve it for sophisticated ones, is more expensive than paying someone in certain countries that have low pay rates to just do that for them, right? So you've got two problems that you're fighting. You're fighting a human problem, right? A human behind the scenes doing the CAPTCHA solving, and now AI as well, right? So these are things you want to consider. Okay, so as far as like the threat landscape, and we talk about things that are the people that are using these IPs, what is the risk category of that person. We are actually seeing nation-state actor threat groups involved with these IPs. So what does that mean for us as security personnel? Well, we have to assume that this adversary has the financial backing, has the technical backing, and the know-how to orchestrate very, very well orchestrated attacks against us. So it's not just that it's just some low-level hacker that's doing this. These are APT groups, right? APT groups. Everybody good with that term? Anybody? No. So threat actors, and there's a list of some of them there, right? Halfnum, Threat Group 338, Vault Typhoon, right? Vault Typhoon. We'll do a little bit more on that one in a minute. APT 41, Magic Hound, right? So you can look on the right, and that gives you the the arguable state that it's involved with, or nation that it's involved with. So then the question becomes, is it only nation-state actors? No. We also found that non-nation-state threat actors, so criminal organizations, right? Those guys are also using these types of strategies. So again, we're just seeing this thing repeat over and over where these things that don't seem like they're a big deal on the surface. Okay, yeah, someone put a backdoor into a gaming app. What does that matter? Well, it's not just someone, right? It's threat groups that are very sophisticated. So when we looked into it, Vault Typhoon was one that CISA put out that seemed to concern them to a great deal. So we looked into that. And what we found, you can see that, that screen there, it's a very, very interesting attack exploit. And for us, what we point out is that the very first part of it is, of course, reconnaissance and initial access. So if you can get in front of the reconnaissance and the initial access, you've already helped yourself immensely, right? So that's step one. However, let's just say they do get past that. Let's say for some reason in your security apparatus, you don't have something that's blocking the reconnaissance and initial access, then where does it go from there? Okay, well then they're going in, they're doing lateral movements inside your organization, they're doing certain things to exfiltrate data and do manipulations within your environment. Now, there are certain ways that you can look for those things. You can use your SIEM tools. You can use other, MDR and other types of activities to try to find those things. And you definitely want to do those things still. You want to layer your security approach, right? What am I doing that if point A fails? I didn't stop the reconnaissance and I didn't stop the initial access. Let's just assume they got in, right? And that's what you do kind of as like a, if you will, a red teamer or someone that you always assume that the worst thing happened. And that's how you build your security, in my opinion. You always want to look at those things. So then you want to figure out how you're doing that. But this was a very interesting use case. And again, with Vault Typhoon, what we found is over on the left, you see the IP client and the geo. Those were all essentially IPs that were used that were not on a list of IP reputation scores or anything like that. So these were not well-known IPs. All right, so here's another thing that we found that was interesting. This is just one, but I'm sure there's others. But we found malicious activity with an APT group called Muddy Water. They were using these IP addresses. So we're like, all right, well, where do those IP addresses relate back to? Well, it goes back to the secure Swiss hosting. Well, all right, how do these bad guys go in and do this? Okay, well, secure Swiss hosting will take cryptocurrencies. You can do essentially a non-authenticated, sign up. So you don't have to provide any kind of credentials to sign up for this service. They don't need anything. All they want is your Bitcoin payment. And you can have an account and you can launch attacks. They don't know that you're launching attacks. I'm sure if you ask them, they're not going to say, well, we're allowing them to launch attacks. But they're not stopping them either, right? Even if you contact those organizations, in a lot of cases, because their whole thing is confidentiality for their customer. So they're not really saying that they're going to block them or stop them. Now, of course, if they do break a law, I'm sure people in Switzerland would stop them. But you have to go through that process. You've got to say, hey, you've got this bad guy doing this thing on your environment. I see his IPs launching these attacks, and you've got to provide all this evidence. It's kind of silly. But this is the type of stuff that we're up against. Okay, so how to prevent automated attacks, right? So again, brute force attacks on the rise, as I mentioned. As a threat actor, I might slow down my attacks. So now your rate limiting tools. We just talked a lot about how using certain IPs, I'm going to get around geofencing and geoblocking, other types of activities. So, and then the other part is stolen credentials. And on one of the previous slides, we saw that database of, was it 10 billion passwords, right? It's a pretty big number. So this is part of the problem that we're seeing on the rise. So CISA put out a statement, and they basically said, hey, if you're not using it for all or at least the appropriate ones, you should be using MFA. That came from Jen Easterly. All right, so what are some other things we can do? As security professionals, which I would say probably most or all the people in this room somehow are, right? We could think of things like FIDO, right? FIDO's been around for a little while. We can do hardware tokens. We can do passkeys. What's the challenge with them? They're not easy to manage. So yes, they're good. They're good at what they do. They make sure that we're protected. I got my hardware token in my back pocket, just as I need it. But at the same time, that's not going to be something we can roll out to all of our customers and all of our clients and users, right? So how to find that balancing act of security and delivery is not necessarily easy. All right, so one of the things that RedShield did was we came out with an email concept similar to essentially MFA, where now we're going to send a link via email to you, and we can implement that in a matter of a few days. So that was something that we, thinking about this threat landscape that we've been talking about today, we've decided this would be a good way to approach that. You can kind of see a little template there of what it looks like. All right, so as far as the process goes, and again, just breaking it down in simple terms, right? You sign up, your administrator is going to do your Okta setup or whatever authentication metric you want to use. You set up the applications that are going to be used and the users and dashboards. And then you open up a ticket with RedShield, you go through the process, we confirm it, we set it up, and then you do the DNS cutover. It's a fairly simple process compared to some MFA implementations. Fun fact down at the bottom, so Delaware DTI is someone that we do help protect, and they actually put out some use case examples of when and where you should be implementing MFA. So if anyone wants to find that, it's a public site that you can look at. All right, so application shielding. So now here kind of the part where I kind of talk about what we do, right? So we are a security service provider. There's a lot of vendors out there that are doing things like WAF, bot, API protections. Those are all great. They're very good at what they do. We do it more of as a service. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a hacker's mindset. Why do we do that? So we started out as pen testers as a company. And so we kind of come from that pedigree of like understanding the threat landscape a little differently. We don't want to just provide just the solution, but actually look at how are people attacking you. So we'll go in, we'll do your scans, we'll validate things. If we do find a vulnerability, we can patch it in a very short period of time in comparison to what it might take your developers or even your security teams to do, depending on all factors, right? And the other thing that we do is we warrant the outcome. So if we do find a vulnerability and we patch it, then we guarantee that that's going to be effective. All right. So there kind of gives you a quick, monitor, find, manage, fix, the overall process lifecycle of how we approach security. All right, so application shielding, which is kind of an unusual term that most people probably have not heard of because it's not that common. But again, we're going in and with a very select way of development because we act as a proxy solution. We sit in the middle. We say, okay, as your traffic passes us, we're going to make some condition changes to your application in real time as it passes through our apparatus, and then we'll feed it back to your clients sanitized, right? And that's essentially how we do the shielding. And that way, we don't have to affect your code. We don't need your developers to get necessarily heavily involved. We can just sit in the middle and make the changes that we need to make. All right, so what are some use cases for this? All right, if again, we want to optimize our AppSec operations, extend the life of legacy assets. So one of the things that we do really, really well is if you've got legacy applications that other WAF, API, and bot solutions don't necessarily work well with because they tend to break, we tend to play very well with those environments. Reduce digital transformation. So if you're going from an on-prem to cloud or vice versa, because we have a cloud solution, we can leave your security in place. You don't have to go, throw up AWS security for some applications, still have your on-prem environment for the other. We can sit in the middle of that, and we can give you security for both environments. And then mixing best-of-breed technologies. So another thing that tends to happen in security is once you get stuck on a security platform or product, it's sometimes hard to untether from that. Because we mix and match what security products we think are best, we put those in for you. You don't have the overhead cost of the devices. You don't have the overhead cost of the engineering mindset to like know, okay, if I'm working with this product set, I need this engineer that can do this. If I'm working with this product set, I need this engineer that can do that. We offload a lot of that cost for you. All right, so what do we recommend that you look for in a security services provider? You should deliver on your offering. So again, going back to that mention of a guarantee, why it seems like in this space there's some people who will give you some form of a guarantee, but it's generally on uptime. So everybody that's familiar with like 5 nines, 999, right? So they give you uptime, but what do they do about security? How are they guaranteeing that they're actually going to give you the appropriate security when they need it? And then those assurances to risk. One of the things you'll see, actually, I think it's in the last slide. So for DTI, for example, CISA went ahead and probed our environment and our security apparatus for DTI, and they found that we did a really good job at protecting them. So that's something that's important because not everybody will get that stamp of approval. And then scale and cost advantages, right? So again, if you're doing all this in-house, it's going to cost you a lot more than if we do it for you. Sometimes, right, the common mantra today is that your teams are spread thin. I don't have enough people to do all the things that need to be done, which is absolutely true. Security is a never-ending timeline of having to learn things and figure out what to do next. We offset that because we're a force multiplier. You got a small team, we make your team bigger. If you don't have any team, we are your team, right? So that's what we do. All right, I'll skip that one. Let's see. Okay, so here's the one I was talking about, right? So security and state applications over the 2020 and 2024 elections. As I mentioned, I think one of the biggest things that come from this, and we've got some great partners over at DTI, Solomon and the rest of his team. We love working with them. So, but they went ahead and they had CISA go ahead and audit us because that was actually part of the requirement for the elections. Was, hey, we got to make sure that you're doing a good job on security. And so, of course, CISA did their part. They did their scanning, their penetration testing, if you will, and they found that we had a very good risk score for Delaware. And I think that's it. How am I doing on time?